And welcome back. Welcome back, Dr. McFall. And we've had a little bit of a hiatus here, but let's start talking about Redeployment by Phil Clay
Yes,
and the Iraq War,
a great novel.
which is in a lot of ways still going on.
Yes,
I mean,
yeah.
We're officially out, but we might get back in. But
In some ways, we are in
this is
with trainers and weapons.
this is the war of your generation,
Mhm.
really. I mean, this is Vietnam was our war. This is your war, and when you're professors, you'll be talking about this as history, and it'll freak you out. But one thing about the Iraq War that because I've been a professor throughout the whole time that we've been at war with Iraq, and I've been reasonably informed citizen, participating in my community and voting and reading the newspapers, and I get the sense that for like 8 years, we really didn't understand as a nation that there was a war on.
No, well, we've been at war since 1991, and most people don't really understand that, and that's so. Remember the background, right? And I remember, I don't know where you were. If you remember this, I actually remember I was watching an NBA game on TBS the night when all of a sudden they cut away from the NBA game to show footage of the Americans bombing Baghdad.
Is this 91?
91.
I remember I heard
think.
this on the radio, and I was in college. I was my first semester of my master's degree program. I went out to a thrift store and bought a TV and came back and hooked it up so we could watch the Iraq War bombing.
It was remarkable. You watch bombing on TV, and this made journalists like Peter Arnett, who was for CNN and reported that day. It made CNN, but not everybody on CNN, because their lead anchor at the time, a guy named Bernard Shaw, spent much of the night hiding under the bed, kind of reporting from under the bed. And shortly thereafter, the Americans invaded, and as part of a coalition, right? This war began as a response to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, and the American counter or invasion that was supposed to retake Kuwait and liberate Kuwait lasted a few weeks, ended very quickly. And
then we went home.
Well,
kind
of. The fighting stopped.
Okay.
Many of the forces stayed in the desert in Saudi Arabia or in Kuwait, and over time in the 90s, the negotiations over the behavior of Saddam Hussein, who was the leader of Iraq, resulted in stalemates, and America increasingly instituted what are called no-fly zones over Iraq. So the infantrymen might have gone home, but the Air Force was flying over Iraq with the authority to shoot people down the entire time. And
then it stays that way, sort of perhaps a low-level war until 2003, right?
In Iraq.
And
so remember that this, like Vietnam as part of a broader war, Iraq is part of a broader war, which by the American government is labeled the war against terrorism. We can argue about that label if you want, but that's the one that's used. And so Iraq is a campaign in this bigger war.
So what was Iraq's tie to terrorism and to
that depends. So one response is we don't know, and we're not going to know for 30 years till the documents come out. We know what the government presented, which was that Iraq was sheltering members of Al-Qaeda, that Iraq was attempting to develop weapons of mass destruction, that it would then give to Al-Qaeda, and that Iraq was attempting to evade the restrictions put on it, which it had never obeyed after the war in 1991, right? And so these are the reasons that are given to the UN in an attempt to get the UN's blessing for a war in Iraq. The UN largely does not believe them, or at least in public does not believe them. It's hard to say in private. But the decision is made by the United States and Britain in particular, but some other allies, that we need to go around or perhaps through the UN and invade anyway. And so this war, right, Iraq 2 really starts in 2003, and it follows the same pattern initially. It's a very rapid American victory.
A couple of weeks, and then Saddam Hussein wasn't in power anymore.
Iraqi troops basically stood aside. Some a very effective bribing of Iraqi generals apparently helped that process. This time, in contrast to 91, the Americans push on and take Iraq and demand the ouster of the Hussein government, which happens. And for a moment, things seem to go very well. But of course, this is the problem with victors, is that something has to take the place of the society that you, or the structure that you destroyed. And that's what the Americans can't get right.
So for 8 years, we're in there trying to build something.
Yes.
And as you probably guessed, military force is much better at breaking stuff than building stuff.
And this is, it's worth thinking about this, because people always, or the military especially, always gets accused of not learning the lesson from the past. In this case, you could reasonably argue that the American Army was guilty of having learned the lessons of the past too well and of trying to be too ethical. And this is what I mean by that. What the American Army does is essentially purge the entire Iraqi government. The people who hadn't left now get kicked out. People in the army get kicked out, politicians kicked out, even down to the level of mayor. And they get kicked out partly because a lot of them have done bad things, and the Americans figured that somebody who's done things that are this bad should not still be in charge. Partly because they had learned what they thought was a lesson from the occupation of Japan and Germany after World War II, where, in fact, because of the onrush of the Cold War, they had abandoned efforts to purge the German and Japanese government. And so former Nazis who had done really terrible things in World War II stay in the government well into the 50s and 60s, and in some cases even the 70s. So they think, we've studied our history. A lot of our officers have graduated from even history grad schools. We're going to learn. And I think you can make an ethical case that this was the right decision. But the consequence was everybody who had been in charge now gets pissed off. And many of them are willing to listen to the elements who want to resist the American occupation.
Now, you've also got, if I read things correctly, you've got a factional civil war between the Shia and the Sunni Islams.
And this is what Hussein had kept under control in very nasty ways. One of the reasons the Americans get re-involved after 91 is that there was a Shia revolt.
And Hussein was a Sunni, correct?
Hussein was a Sunni.
But the majority of Iraqis are
Shia.
But a majority of about 55, 60%?
Yeah, it's a little higher than that.
Okay.
So the Sunnis are actually a little bit more of a minority.
That makes a democracy really hard.
Yeah.
Because if you're you have what James Madison called a permanent faction.
Yeah.
So you have 35 or 40% of the people who are never going to win anything, and who it's very difficult to convince people who can never win an election to be part of a democratic process.
And I talk all the time in my classes about democracy is not simply having a vote, right? Democracy is partly about the particularities of the arrangements, right? So in this particular case, the question then becomes, to what degree is the Constitution and the governmental structures designed to protect the minority rights, to prevent the majority from doing what they want, fearing that the majority is going to repress the minority? And to what degree is a democracy, these structures really built to allow the majority, which in some sense ought to be able to make a decision in a democracy, to allow the majority to do what it wants, right? And that's a really hard balance to get, and it varies from place to place and time to time, I think.
So who are we fighting during this 8 years? Are we fighting Sunnis who don't want to participate in the Shia majority-dominated government?
So much of what we are fighting are, in fact, Sunnis who feel disenfranchised by the new willingness of the Americans to accept and endorse Shia control.
Because it's the democratic vote.
Exactly. And that's the American perspective, is that we now put the people who are the majority in charge. These new Shia leaders, by and large, not entirely, but by and large, are not willing to reach out and try and craft a common culture between Sunni and Shia. Rather, they see this as their opportunity to get the upper hand on the people who would oppress them. Many of the Sunnis who resist were former Iraqi army officers or men who may have an ethnic or religious stake, but also have an economic stake, right? They were well off in the old Iraq. Now they are not well off, and they feel like they want that position back. We are occasionally fighting Shia because, of course, the Shia group or caste is not completely uniform. There are people who don't like us and people who do like us.
And let's just For the sake of everybody, do a quick gloss on Sunni and Shia.
Sure. So this is what Americans probably would be most familiar calling a denominational split, right? But it's much more significant. It goes back to the 600s in the formation of Islam, and it's a complicated story, but broadly speaking, most of this, the Muslims who emerge out of the 6th century follow a particular strand of Islam, and they call themselves Sunnis. But there is a minority who emerges from the 600 following a different strand of Islam. And they have been in tension, I think, not in tension, but they have been in tension, right? There have been tensions between them ever since, really.
And the major Shia power is Iran.
Iran, correct.
So the Shia Muslims of Iraq are sort of have a natural affinity to Iran.
And the precursor to all of this, of course, is a lengthy war in the 1980s between Iraq and Iran, one where, for complicated reasons, the United States backed Iraq and the Sunnis who at that time were running Iraq, and that's why the Sunnis, in the 80s and 90s are so paranoid about the Shia because they see this as an actual fifth column sponsored by Iraq.
Right.
So now, if you've got all that, you can take the exam right now.
Let's talk a little bit about what the American soldier is doing between 2003 and 2010.
Yeah.
For like 20 minutes of this, they're fighting the actual Iraqi army and deposing Saddam Hussein. Then what's your average soldier doing from day to day? I mean, one thing I noticed about this book, very different than the things they carried, is the things they carried just seemed to be one platoon off the reservation, doing what it wanted to do and getting in trouble. Whereas here, you have a very strong sense of authority. Yeah. The soldiers rarely leave their base, so they go out for a mission for an hour or two, and then they go back to their base. So it seems like a much more controlled environment for a soldier, and they seem like much better soldiers.
Yeah. So the first thing to remember is that this is not a drafty army.
Yeah.
This is a professional army. So in some sense, everybody who's there has volunteered for it. It's also, in an interesting kind of way, a much more southern, much more white evangelical army than the War of Vietnam is, which has some kind of interesting ethical implications as we look at the broader spectrum. They're still fighting an insurgency war. Excuse me, I've got a cold. Still fighting what we kind of commonly call guerrillas, right? People who often dress as civilians, people who try and blend into the civilian population, people who are attempting to use surprise tactics, in this case IEDs, improvised explosive devices, right? Bombs that are set, whether booby-trapped artillery shells or improvised bombs, whatever it is, that they bury in little holes in the road, or mortars that are fired for a few minutes and then quickly moved. In that sense, the experience is the same, but this is a much more orderly, professional kind of experience for the ordinary soldier.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so they're trying to find out who the insurgents are, and
they're trying to identify the insurgents and kill or capture them. Now, there are a few cases, and they refer to them in the book, in particular a city called Fallujah, where they decide that individual cities are so dominated by the resistance that they have to go in and essentially fight a conventional battle to root them out. So there are conventional battles. But for the most part, this is counterinsurgency warfare without the jungle.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about redeployment. And first of all, there are a lot of things about this book that remind me of the things they carried. And about half of the people who provided blurbs mentioned O'Brien and the things they carried, and sort of see this as the next great war novel, except it's not a war novel because it's not a novel. Yeah. And that's the first thing I notice about the difference here. In the things they carried, you have a series of stories, vignettes, all by the same narrator whose name is O'Brien, who is very close to the author, and we can call it a novel because really these things do string together into a narrative arc, and we can say this is the author's perspective because O'Brien, the author, has lots to do with O'Brien, the character, and we really seem to be getting his perspective on this. Here we have 12 stories by 12 very different narrators. You know, one of them is an African American student, one of them is a chaplain who's an officer, one of them is an American Foreign Service officer trying to rebuild Iraq. Some of them are Marine infantry. So we don't get a consistent perspective in this book of stories, which makes it a much more fragmented reading experience, and it makes it harder to find Phil Clay, the author. You know, to try to find out what he's telling us is much more difficult than it is in the things they carried, because the things they carried, he tells us what he wants us to know. Here, he's often working against characters that he can't possibly identify with all of these characters because they have so many different perspectives. So where do you...
It was an interesting reading experience, because I like other books, I read this traveling in Europe, and so I read this largely late at night while I was sitting in a bed in a hostel somewhere. And I opened this book, I remember, in Vienna, and I read the first story, and I thought, after I had finished O'Brien again, and I kind of said, okay, I know where this is going. I know how to read this because I just read O'Brien. And then I started the second one.
Let's talk about the first story first.
What an odd story to start a collection off of.
I mean, and that's the title story.
Yeah.
Redeployment, and it's about killing dogs.
Is it?
Well,
I mean, it has killing dogs in it. I'm not sure it's about killing dogs, though.
What's it about?
So I'm struck sitting here, and I hadn't thought about this before, but we both have our books in front of us.
Right here.
And I think, if I remember right, the O'Brien cover is of a soldier carrying a weapon. I think. The cover here, right, and this is on I'm sure you have the similar book, is of a soldier kind of standing at ease with his rucksack standing. It's not clear where he is. He could theoretically be in Iraq. But I think he's probably at home, or on some process
he's
of
at
going
a
home.
subway station almost, or
a
bus station.
And in some sense, the story is a story about what it's like to go home.
Yeah.
And it of course concludes with killing a dog.
Well, it starts with killing dogs.
Well, yes.
I mean, it's
bookends.
And isn't that the sense of why it's a redeployment? The man, while he was in Iraq, his unit started killing dogs.
That's true.
And then he feels like it's his duty when his dog needs to be put down. He can't, and I quote, pay some asshole $100 to give him an injection.
Yep.
He's got to go do it himself. And somehow that's connected to what he feels is his soldierly duty.
Yeah. And
right.
So what struck me was, in looking at this morning, is his talk about, I forget what he calls it, orange and white, I think. Conditions. So basically says, he's talking about when he goes shopping with his wife. And about, he's here in the city in, I don't remember where it is, North Carolina or somewhere. It felt like Virginia, somewhere in the...
Florida, actually.
Is it Florida?
Jacksonville,
okay.
Says,
I knew it was somewhere in the southeast. And he's in the city, and he cannot escape the kind of physical and biological response that is appropriate for a combat situation.
Right.
By the time he's done, having gone through this crowded city where every sense he has is alert to threats, and he gets back in the car, and now he's so wired he wants to go 100 miles an hour, so he decides he better not drive, he better have his wife drive. Right? Yeah. This is, at least for the moment, he's no longer serving at the front line. But in his responses, he's been redeployed. He has not returned. He's still in Iraq in some important way.
And that sounds very much like what O'Brien says about Vietnam.
Yep.
The Vietnam vet comes home, can't leave the war behind, can't leave the things he did behind. It's a thing that he carried.
Yeah.
And it's like this Operation Scooby where they shot dogs, probably, I'm guessing, just to police the area because dogs were bringing germs and licking blood and disease vectors.
Yep.
So they would shoot dogs, and this, because he's a dog lover, makes him feel very bad.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that he carries, and he makes a resolution that when it comes time that he has to put his dog down, he can't evade that responsibility as a soldier. Man, that just sounds like what a Vietnam vet might go through.
Yeah. And it's pervade, right? The wife is there as a character, it seems to me, to show that.
Yeah.
She's written a little bit comically, right? The to-do list, right? When you get home, you got a to-do list, and it's me. But she's really there to show how difficult it is for him to adjust to being home rather than being a kind of living character on her own.
Right. But then we go into some very different kinds of stories.
Yes, we do.
I mean, because it's not a consistent point of view or a consistent set of ideas even. Mm-hmm. A couple of things that really strike me about this book. One is it is a much more profane book than anything we've read. I mean, the language is very profane. You have, I think...
So does that make it a more honest book?
Well, according to O'Brien, they're supposed to be.
Yeah, and yet O'Brien isn't profane in this way.
Not nearly to this level.
No.
I think the one that my wife saw me reading for the first time was in Vietnam they had whores. And she just looked at me and she said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm teaching, dear." But that's something that we saw a little bit of in All Quiet on the Western Front. I mean, there was a scene with prostitutes. And then, of course, there's that whore of death in Goodbye Darkness. But here you have just a very frank sexual portrayals and just a whole lot of profanity.
And a way of using military terms and abbreviations that is, at least in some cases, I don't think always, but in some cases meant to try and persuade you that this is a truthful or at least an accurate kind of a representation.
Do you think this is just a difference between the authors, or is this a difference between the wars?
I don't think it's a difference between either one. I think it's a difference between the times at home.
The times at home.
That I cannot imagine. So my degree is actually in military history, and I cannot imagine soldiers not speaking like this in some way, shape, or form. It would be different at various times. But certainly the kind of sexual behaviors that he writes are very typical of soldiers. There's all these stories, there are brothels in both wars. I don't think, though, that Hemingway, to pick one, could have gotten a readership in the 20s.
Hemingway couldn't have gotten away with a novel like this. Actually, if you look at some of the posthumous novels that Hemingway wrote before he died, like The Garden of Eden is one of them. It reads like this. But in 1920, there were censorship codes that were still very strong, and this kind of language would not have been allowed.
I'm a little more surprised that O'Brien doesn't use it, and a little more curious as to why.
Yeah,
I assume by that point in American history, this kind of language would have been more acceptable.
Well, that's 95. Yeah, we've had Portnoy's complaint since then. So, yeah, but it does.
I wonder if it. So does it make you feel less sympathetic to the characters?
No.
I don't think it does for me either.
No, I think it makes me feel, it shocks me. I mean, I think I feel shocked and slapped around a bit every time I read one of these stories. I think it's supposed to shock me and slap me around a bit. I think O'Brien is shocking too, but O'Brien uses the subject matter more to shock. Torturing a baby water buffalo to death by shooting its legs off. That's pretty shocking too. And and he drops his share of F-bombs, but not quite at this level. Another thing I really noticed, and this is in two stories especially, OIF, very short story that is really, I think, just a satire of military terminology. I think it's a great story. This starts on page 73, and I had to sit by my computer looking up every other word in order to make any sense out of this. But this sort of alphabet soup satire we get in just about every war. I mean, this is MASH in the Korean War. This is No Time for Sergeants with Andy Griffith in World War II.
That I'm not familiar with.
There's a long history of war stories that just make fun of what a bureaucratic mess the Army is. And I think that's a funny little story. But then you look at the story that comes, I think, right after it. Money as a Weapon System. And you get this sense of bureaucracy that's more than just a funny little satire. You get a sense of how ineffective America, with all of its money and all of its corporate culture, is in transforming a region that it doesn't understand.
And that's And that in some ways, this is where I think the difference between O'Brien and Clay becomes more distinct. Because when I read that story, I think it's meant to make me sad. I mean, it's supposed to amuse me, but it's not really supposed to anger me in the way that O'Brien wants to make me angry at the ethical lapses and the failure of leadership in Vietnam. There's ethical lapses here, but there's more stupidity here. There's more inability to understand.
I think my favorite passage in the whole book is in this story, and it's, let me find the page here. Yeah, page 109. I don't want to see U.S. supplied equipment in a torture video, I said. This is the young American State Department employee. Too late for that, said Major Seamount. Besides, if there's one thing I've learned doing civil affairs in Iraq, it's that it's hard to come in and change people's culture. What do you mean, I said. Right now, he said, the Shia are pretty set in their ways of drilling people to death. And the Sunnis like to cut off heads. I don't think we'll manage to change that with baseball bats.
And that's funny. That's a funny line.
Funny, tragic.
Yes.
It's funny, like...
Yes.
Here we have this guy, this big donor back in Montana or somewhere, who convinces a congressman that what Iraq needs is baseball team. So he sends baseball uniforms and demands that we take pictures of it. And so this guy, his job is to go out and make a congressman happy, make a constituent happy by taking pictures of Iraqi kids playing baseball, because of course baseball, that great icon of American culture, is going to transform Iraq from a deeply corrupt, fundamentalist, factional, split-apart country into something great like America. And it's just such a stupid.
Yeah, that's right. It's a tragic line. It's a funny line, but implicit in it is also a sense of who the enemy is. That's very different than you get in O'Brien, right? In O'Brien, the other side are the farmers who look by bewildered while you end up setting up camp in a dung pit. Here, the enemy are people who take a drill and drill through your ankles, who behead you, who take pictures of torture and post them on YouTube.
Yeah, that story, that was the Frago story, where they come in and they find that they've been filming this video drilling people's ankles out as a torture. But you also have a different sense of your friends.
Yes.
Because their friend is this wealthy sheik who is just taking as much money as possible from the United States and from what I can tell, not doing anything with it.
And that's not new either, right? There's lots of characters in MASH who do exactly the same thing.
Yeah, but there's a sense, and I think you're correct, that I don't think that Clay is a pacifist by any sense.
Right. And I don't think this is an anti-war book.
No, but it's sort of a, and I've heard this from everybody. I have a few friends who have served in Iraq, and they have all told me exactly the same thing. We're trying to change a culture. We don't even understand the first things about it. And nation building is hard enough with military force when you it was hard enough. We didn't even successfully do this in our own South during Reconstruction.
Yeah.
It's hard enough when you do understand the country, but to come in with baseball uniforms, that's just a great metaphor, and try to change this culture without understanding its history, its religious factions.
This war is really kind of an existential issue for America. And what I mean by that is that for hundreds of years, Americans have seen themselves as being in a country that is a city on a hill, right? Where the ideals of America are universalist, that sometimes people might not understand them, sometimes people may disagree with them, but in the end, everybody should be like us. And the question then is, how then do you approach a situation where people don't seem to want to be like you? And so when in my graduate program at Ohio State, that was one of the places that the military sent its officers to before they went to teach at West Point or at the Air Force Academy. So I met and grew to like any number of majors and captains and lieutenant colonels who were kind of on their way back and forth from the battlefield to teaching positions. And there was an absolute conviction among these people in the need to do history and to do area studies as part of a military career because they had faced this in their lives. And they knew how damaging and how dangerous it was when you didn't understand the people you were interacting with. And with those best of intentions, we still get stories like this.
Mm-hmm. And is it the military people or the politicians and the corporate people who are making those mistakes?
Well, it's clearly the politicians and the corporate people, but I think it is also, at least I think Clay believes, I'm not sure if mistake is the right word, that the military people he's talking about are not equipped, for whatever reason, mistake or whatever you want to call it, are not equipped to succeed in this environment.
All right, well, we're coming to the end of the lecture, but keep reading the rest of the stories, and we will be back to talk a little bit more in depth about some of these stories. So see you real soon.